Ever since the OPEC oil cartel announced it was slashing production, we've seen a steady rise in gas prices across the country. The president seemed pretty pleased with himself when gas prices were coming down after he depleted the strategic oil reserves, but not so much so now. Here's what he had to say last night.
This House and Senate gets back, they're going to have to, there's going to be some consequences for what they've done with Russia.
Blaming OPEC, he now says there are going to be consequences. But what about the policies of this administration? How have they caused this spike in energy cost? You know, when you look back on what he has done in the first 2 years, the finger shouldn't be pointed at Putin or OPEC. Should be coming right back to this administration. Joining me now to talk about this and what is behind the rise in energy prices in our country and how they could be brought under control is Myron Ebell. He's the director of the Competitive Enterprise Institute's Center for Energy and Environment. Myron, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
All right, Myron, I really want to go into, the president seems to be pointing the fingers everywhere. First, it was because of Putin. Of course, when the prices went down, when he was artificially keeping them low with depleting the strategic oil reserves, it was all about him. Now OPEC is to blame. But really, this is much deeper than this. The policies of this administration have been driving up energy prices since day one.
You're absolutely right, Tony. President Biden claims that he cares about high gasoline prices and high electric rates. But in fact, all of his policies are designed to make energy more expensive. So he just wants to blame somebody and say it has nothing to do with me. OPEC shouldn't be cutting oil production. But in fact, of course, the weak position that the United States is in is giving OPEC the opportunity to do that. If we were still energy dominant, as we were under President Trump, then OPEC was in a very weak position, and that's why gasoline was $2.50 a gallon instead of $4 a gallon.
Now, Myron, this is also a national security issue, because if we are dependent upon foreign sources and we need energy to fight a war, we're over a barrel.
Absolutely. And of course, one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia has been so unhelpful to help President Biden out of his political difficulty of supporting higher energy prices but trying to blame others for them. Saudi Arabia, of course, President Biden has done everything he can to alienate them. He's supported the Iran deal. Well, who is in the entire Near East and Middle East, who is Saudi Arabia's biggest enemy? It's Iran. So he's supporting an Iran deal which would pay them off with $100 billion and put them back in the world stage. He's not helping them in Yemen, and he's basically said nasty things about them, starting back with his campaign. So they have no reason to bail him out of his own policy decisions.
So, Myron, let's look a little bit at the policies of this administration, which, as you pointed out, if we were doing domestic production, it wouldn't matter what they were doing overseas. But in January of 2021, as soon as he came into office, he rejoined the Paris Agreement, which has implications for us here. He issued an executive order on protecting public health and environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis, which canceled the Keystone Pipeline. And correct me if I'm wrong, but even though that was in the distance, gasoline fuel prices are based a lot on speculation of what's going to be available in the future. And so the president could help keep prices down even now, if he would say, look, I'm going to remove a lot of these regulations we put in place. We're not going to try to hamper the funding, which is another layer of restriction that they put on energy companies. That could have an immediate impact, could it not, on energy prices?
Absolutely. You're right about what people think of it's going to happen in the near future. And I'm glad you mentioned the Paris Climate Treaty. He started with the Paris Climate Treaty, and then he made another commitment that we're going to reduce emissions even more than we promised under the Paris Climate Treaty. He stopped leasing federal lands and offshore areas for oil production. And he's been trying to implement financial regulations which will discourage investment in oil, gas, coal production, and in refining and in pipelines. So if you need pipelines to get heating oil to New England, you're out of luck. If you need a pipeline to get natural gas to a market, you're out of luck because they're trying to stop all those things.
And they're using that funding mechanism of the of financing to leverage restrictions by pushing the green energy, saying, look, if you're going to loan money, you need to go so much needs to go toward new green renewable energy and only a certain percentage to fossil fuels. Is that right?
Well, the percentage to fossil fuels is zero under the ESG agenda, which they're pushing on the financial community. They're trying, even beyond the regulations, they're just trying to scare big investors and financial firms from investing in coal, oil, and gas. So if the money isn't there, then production isn't going to go up, it's going to go down. And in fact, production has gone up as a result of high prices, but it could have gone up a lot more if we had the favorable policies of the preceding president.
So, final question for you, Myron. When the administration says, "Oh, we're encouraging companies to pump oil and to refine gasoline," they're not being honest because they have all these layers of restrictions that are actually keeping them from doing it.
Yes, they lie. When you say they're not being honest, they just lie. They're trying to get past the election by lying to the American people about what their policies really are. Their policies are to raise energy prices by reducing production, and they're succeeding. That's why electric rates are going up in most parts of the country.
But the Saudis pulled the curtain back on them and have exposed them going into this election. Myron Ebell, good to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tony.